Good morning. Hello to everyone. A big thank you to all of you who are here in the room, that you came in person to participate in this event. And of course, thank you very much to all of you who are online. We are doing one of our first hybrid events, and it's interesting to see what is the combination of people showing up online and showing up in person. So I'm Annabelle Gonzalez, Deputy Director General here at the World Trade Organization, and I'm very excited to welcome you for this discussion on the future of the WTO. We are very lucky to have with us today our guest speaker, a dear friend and tireless supporter of the WTO and the rules-based trading system, Arantxa González Laya. Arantxa, it's a real pleasure to welcome you back to the WTO. I can think of a few people better placed than Arantxa to help us think through the myriad challenges facing the WTO and the rules-based trading system in the run-up to our ministerial conference in June. Of course, many of you know Arantxa as a former WTO colleague from her days as Chief of Staff in the office of Director General Pascal Lamy. Since leaving the WTO in 2013, Arantxa's stellar career has seen her hold several positions, first as Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and Executive Director of the International Trade Center, and then as Spain's Minister of Foreign Affairs, European Union, and Cooperation. Arantxa recently took up the role of Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs, or Sciences Po, the first woman ever to hold that position. So congratulations, Arantxa. But today we're in for a double treat, as we also have with us as discussant, Dr. Simon Evenett, who is Professor of International Trade and Economic Development at the University St. Gallen Endowment for Prosperity Through Trade. Simon has a distinguished career in academia and international public service. He is well known to us here at the WTO, of course, as a leading thinker on trade issues, as the father of the Global Trade Alert Initiative, a leading monitoring trade policy, and as someone who tells it like it is. Simon, Arantxa, thank you so much for joining us. We need fresh insights and perspectives to help us understand the myriad changes in the world economy and what they mean for the future of the WTO. So a detailed and careful discussions of these issues is more important than ever. With every passing day, the list of global trade challenges is getting longer, while the willingness to tackle those challenges cooperatively appears to be shrinking. And this is very worrisome for an organization like ours, which is built on the promise of global trade cooperation as a means to unleash growth, alleviate poverty, raise living standards, ensure full employment, and promote sustainable development. The economic fallout from the tragic war in Ukraine is already transforming global economic relations. Even on the heels of several massive shocks, all of them with huge implications for the WTO, from trade tensions between the major trading partners to a once-in-a-century pandemic, and from continued supply chain disruptions to rapidly growing threats to food security. And we cannot simply wish all of this away and return to the more geopolitically and economic stable days when the WTO was created. It is time to reimagine the role and place of the WTO in the world as it is, not the world as it should be, or the world as we should like it to be. The world as it is one where global value chains are being reconfigured as businesses around the world step up efforts to diversify their supplier base in light of once unimaginable tail risks. The world as it is also one where concerns about economic interdependence are likely to reshape trade policies with renewed calls for self-sufficiency and protectionism from some quarters. The retreat from trade openness and cooperation could have serious repercussions for all countries, especially developing and the most vulnerable economies, who aspire to follow in the steps of countries that successfully use trade-led growth to transform their economies. So in a world with less trade cooperation, the benefits of trade for efficiency, innovation, and resilience gradually but surely give way to higher costs, lower living standards, and more vulnerability to future climate, pandemic, and other shocks. And that's a lose-lose proposition, which will make everyone worse, not better off. So WTO members have a responsibility to do everything in their power to avoid such an outcome. And our upcoming ministerial conference provides an opportunity to take a step in that direction. So with that, let me turn to Arantxa for her remarks. I will then ask Nation and give us his own views, and then we will open the floor to questions from all of you, both here at the WTO and also online. So Arantxa, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Annabelle, for putting this event together. Thank you to the WTO for hosting us today. In this room, I'm the other Gonzalez. There is Annabelle, and then there is Arantxa, and this is why coming here is such a pleasure, is to reconnect with so many old friends, but also to discuss a topic that is close to my heart. How do we maintain alive the spirit of multilateral cooperation? This is what this organization is about. And this is a value that today is facing very strong winds. And I think it is important that we ask ourselves the question, how do we keep, for those of us who value this as a structuring feature of international relations, how do we keep this alive? We are in one, as you said, one of the very initial meetings in presence as the impact of the pandemic recedes, and as we get back to some sort of new normality. This new normality has features that have changed international trade, some of which are going to be with us for the short term, but there are other changes that will be with us for the longer term. On the short term, there are disruptions in value chains, there's been disruptions in logistics, which no doubt are contributing to inflation around the world, which should also lead us to think about the value of this organization in terms of managing our economies in a more efficient manner. But there are longer term features that the pandemic has brought to us that we will need to grapple with. More regional value chains, so regionalization of value chains, greater attention to sustainability considerations. This is also what has come with this pandemic. And the growing space that digitalization and technology is having also as part of international trade. Now, if those changes were not enough, we also are facing strong winds from geopolitics. Power was always an ingredient in international relations. It's all about power. But what we are seeing now is power as the main structuring feature of an international order. This is what has changed, and this is what is worrying. And this is what we are seeing in its latest iteration with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This is what divides the international community today. I don't think today is the West against the rest. It is a divide between those who believe that the international system has to be based on rules, on norms, on institutions, and those who do not believe in rules, norms, and institutions and prefer power. This is a divide that we have to grapple with because it's a fundamental divide. The system we live in today is the one that was built after tragic events internationally that led us to believe that having a system of rules, of norms, that's what we call a rules-based international order, was better than just having purely power-based relationships. What I can tell you, and this is the bitter experience when you go back to your national life, is that The vast majority of us are not in a position to be winners in a purely power-based international system. And this is why, if we care about not just being pushed around by power, if we care about having our space in an international system, we have to care about institution, norms, and rules at the international level. And this is what the WTO is about. And this is, in a nutshell, why I think we have to care about the WTO. It's the insurance policy against purely power-based international relations. Now, it's also institutions, norms like the WTO that will protect us and will help us manage a growing feature of the international community, which is interdependence. This is also what has happened in the last 60, 70 years, and that's also what a rules-based order can help us manage better. So yeah, WTO is today, as the title of this conference indicates, navigating choppy waters. This is not new. There were pre-existing conditions that the WTO had to navigate, but I would say that the problems that the WTO, as part of the international rules-based order, faces are deeper and wider. And this is why I think, as Annabelle was saying at the beginning, we have to be lucid about the diagnostic and then see what steps we can take to protect the organization and what it represents. So, Annabelle, I'd like to start by describing the three big risks that I see ahead for an organization like the World Trade Organization. The first risk that I see is the risk of its members disinvesting the WTO, not paying enough political attention or not investing enough political capital in the organization. To use wait as the name of the game, wait for when the political circumstances improve, wait for when the next round of elections happen in this country or that country, wait until the winds are more favorable. And I think this is a problem because this is an organization, like every organization needs a bit of investment. It's like any business, it needs an investment. It's like any household, it needs an investment. If you don't invest, it's not that the organization will stand still, is that it probably we will dent the abilities of the organization. Now, there may be a temptation, as I say, to not invest in the WTO and invest elsewhere. Invest in building trade relations with closer neighbors at the regional level or with friends across the world. And I think it's important to continue, don't get me wrong, to advance trade opening, trade reforming, trade regulations wherever we can, at the regional level, with friends, with as many as you can. But you also need to make this compatible with an investment in the multilateral trading system. Because if we don't invest in the WTO, we run the risk that the system that it represents no longer self-restrains the worst instincts of all of us, of all members, but also that the organization grows further apart from the realities of business on the ground. So this is the first risk, that we don't invest enough in the organization. The second risk is obviously the risk of geopolitics permeating economics. The return of economic security considerations that hollow the basic tenets of the organization, the return of blocs, and ultimately the fragmentation of the international trading system. And I think I would caution against following this avenue, because I think in a world where the name of the game is interdependence, going back to blocks and going back to fragmentation of the rules of international trade would probably lead to reduced growth, reduce innovation, and reduce global prosperity. And I think this should concern us, given how difficult it is to generate growth, innovation, and prosperity worldwide. Ultimately, I think to speak the language that we are hearing a lot and that Simon is writing a lot, decoupling at the global level will probably make us poorer. So I think what's important is to keep the idea that the WTO can continue to help us manage interdependence. It's not the only organization to do that. There is much more than the WTO, but the WTO has to play its role. The third risk is the risk of overburdening the WTO, thinking that the World Trade Organization will deliver results with growing expectations in many areas where, frankly, ultimately the WTO cannot deliver results because it is not within the realm of the WTO. The WTO, in a nutshell, is about making trade possible. But making trade happen and making sure that trade benefits all, it's also within the realm of domestic policies and international cooperation in areas other than international trade. What has happened in this last few months on international taxation, for example, is an interesting avenue to ensure the benefits of trade flow in a fairer manner across countries. What is being done on reducing CO2 emissions is also very important to ensure that we manage interdependence. There's a very interesting article this morning on the New York Times, for those who haven't read it, about the impact that global warming is having on the depletion of ocean stocks. We need the WTO, but we also need to make sure that the domestic reforms in education, in innovation, in infrastructures also are made in sync with trade opening, and that we do not put the blame of failing domestic policies on the WTO because this would be an unfair criticism, since to a large extent the WTO will not be able to deal with them. So these are the risks. But I think it's also useful that we look at what can be done, because it's otherwise too easy to describe the situation without making some proposals. So I'm going to venture on a 3-point proposal that I would like to put to all of you so that we can keep the conversation going. The first one is what I would call make sure that we keep the WTO lights on. So let's make sure that in the coming weeks, with the idea of a ministerial conference around the corner, we work to ensure this WTO ministerial produces tangible results. This is what will show the willingness of the members of the organization to keep investing in an organization that will help them manage interdependence. There are the list of issues, you know them better than I do. My knowledge is a bit dusted by now, but I think there is an agreement on fish subsidies that should be a no-brainer, given what science is telling us of what will happen if we do not take action, which is that there will not be any more fish. There is obviously a package of pandemic response measures that this organization can take in support of what other organizations and governments at home have done. There is obviously the response on the agricultural side that this organization can also provide to make sure that countries are better prepared to face what risks to be another food crisis. This by means of some of the areas where tangible results are possible and therefore should be part of the scenarios that members work on. The second item on the to-do list would be to make sure that work starts to adapt the WTO. Start a process of adaptation of the organization to the new circumstances. In WTO parlance, I think you talk about WTO reform, but you know, the R word is a bit loaded. So I prefer to use the word adapt. Let's adapt the WTO to the new circumstances. Now, it requires to have a shared understanding among members about what has changed in international trade. What are the new areas that require attention? What are the new circumstances that require a regulatory framework? What are the improvements in the governance of the organization that are also needed? And I think it would be extremely helpful to mandate the Secretariat to produce a bit of knowledge to be discussed by all members to get a shared understanding of what are these new circumstances and how these new circumstances can be dealt with in a new version of the WTO. The third recommendation that I'd like to put for your consideration is obviously to make sure that we build better coherence between what the WTO can do and what organizations other than WTO can do also to bring greater coherence given the integrated nature of a lot of the economic issues at hand. Coherence was traditionally understood as WTO, World Bank, and IMF. I think today this needs to go well beyond that. We need to connect better WTO with the world of climate change, UNFCCC, biodiversity conventions, conventions in the area of sustainability. There is to connect better WTO with energy, a key issue in our landscape for the future, with the area of work, with taxation, with agriculture, with standards, all of which are the new areas to integrate together with international trade. So I think in a nutshell, we need the WTO to remain active. We need a change, a WTO adapted to the changing circumstances, and we surely need the WTO as part of a wider ecosystem of organizations helping members manage their interdependence. So this is Annabelle by means of kicking the conversation, and again, very eager to dialogue with Simon and then with the rest of the participants.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Arantxa, for this thorough assessment and for your recommendations. We will have time to discuss more about them. Simon, let me now turn over to you, please.
Thank you, Annabelle. And it's a great pleasure to follow Arantxa. And for those of you who are younger, this was an absolute tour de force. And I think it reflects your distinguished career in public service here and in many other places. I also note that your new position as Dean of an International Affairs School means that we now have 4 out of 5 of the International Affairs schools in Europe, the leading ones, led by women. If only the European Institute in Florence would catch up. And then it would be a full house. Okay, no, congratulations on this new role. I'd love to see where you're going to take this. I'm sure you've met some of these other women. Nari Woods at Oxford is a force of nature, and so are you. And today it's a great honor to be able to comment on your presentation, which in true French style involved 3 sets of 3. Right? I'm sure for those of you who've been educated in French, the French system, everything comes in 3s. So you first started off with the short run, the long run, and the geopolitical as the context. Thank you for that. Then the 3 big risks, and then the 3 takeaways. Yep. So let me reflect on a few of them. To start with, I agree with you very strongly that the context has changed, and I see this breaking down in terms of what we see on the ground in terms of cross-border commerce, and then how the policies have changed a lot over the last 10 to 15 years. So in terms of what we see in terms of cross-border commerce, we have trade in goods, which is, for at least the industrialized countries, has been stagnant since 2015 in volume terms. And the motor seems to have stopped there. Amongst the emerging market regions, very substantial variation, with maybe East Asia doing better than others. But we have essentially a significant divergence there in performance, reflecting in part, I think, what Annabelle noted earlier also that there has been a series of shocks. And, you know, about 5 years ago, if there was a shock, we would just reassure policymakers and business executives that this, you know, normal service would be resumed very soon. And we can't do this anymore. I mean, there've just been so many shocks when I present to corporate boards or to policymakers. You can't persuade people that we will go back to where we were because the risk is very much at the center of their thinking, and I'll pick up on this more later. The second area where we see big changes is in foreign direct investment patterns. And here FDI flows have not kept up with global growth. In fact, if you deflate FDI flows by any sensible metric of global GDP or global investment flows, we are pretty much at a 25-year low for this. This vehicle for entering markets seems to be less and less attractive. And the reason is, I think, and we have some good data on this now, in particular from American multinationals, is that the returns on FDI have fallen considerably, especially in emerging markets. There's no real serious return premium over what we see in investments in industrialized countries. And this then makes you worry that the policy uncertainty that we are seeing growing over time is not being compensated by a return premium. And so not surprisingly, boards are doing less of this. And this is, I think, a concern as well. Border movement of people has clearly been frustrated by COVID for obvious reasons. And this, and then add on top of this growing sort of nationalistic policies on migration, we have a problem there. The only bright spot really is in the area of services, in particular digitally delivered services. And here, the good news is tempered somewhat by the fact that we have an incredible increase in the amount of regulation, which potentially could become a source of fragmentation itself. Yep. And then that leads me to the second point about the developments on the ground. When you look back over the last sort of 10 years, there haven't been many, unfortunately, multilateral initiatives that have worked. The biggest international economic accord was signed in Paris, not in Geneva, with the text. Yep. So the multilateral level has unfortunately not been as active as we'd like. The regional level seems to have lost a lot of traction, especially when you're dealing with mega regionals. So that's gone. And the action really has been at the unilateral level. And when I look at the data, I see a lot of action when it comes to goods and services in the area of corporate subsidies, which I think is the item. And the key thing about corporate subsidies to understand is that it's very firm specific. So the politics of corporate subsidies is very different than a tariff or something like this. If a firm can get a great corporate subsidy out of its government and its rivals at home don't get them, then they have no interest in subsidy reform. Right? And so this is a topic which has developed over the last 10 to 15 years and has indeed become a source of trade tensions between countries. Secondly, we do see growing policy uncertainty. This is now fairly well measured by different types of economic approaches. And that's important because, of course, when we think about the system here, it was one of the things it was designed to do was to limit the amount of uncertainty faced by traders and to build confidence that their plans would not be disrupted. So the second big development is of course policy uncertainty. And then the third, I mean, I think that I've alluded to this earlier, I worry a lot about the potential fragmentation in the digital economy. And there is a whole series of legitimate public policy concerns there, which are being translated into policy without any serious reference to the types of principles which we value in this institution. So non-discrimination, transparency, procedural fairness. These are important factors which we use to design policy, which are not being taken into account as far as I can see. So I strongly agree with the diagnosis of Arantxa that essentially we have a world which is developing and we have a WTO rulebook which has stayed relatively static. Yep. And where there needs to be some degree of catch-up, and that catch-up will require a number of things which I'll come to. Now, if this wasn't bad enough, quite rightly, as Arantxa says, we have the recent conflict in Ukraine on top of this. And like her, I do see risks of fragmentation if this process is not managed properly. The first big decision point will come when there is evidence of sanctions evasions or evasion of sanctions imposed by some countries on Russia. And then the question is whether the firms engaging in those sanctions are hit with punishment, or whether the countries in which those firms are based are hit with sanctions. And this might be problematic if the shipping companies or the transport companies involved are state-owned or state-linked, right? And so I think one very important fork in the road happens at that point when evidence of sanction evasion arises. Now, there will be sanction evasion. One of my students did a piece of work several years ago for the Swiss Parliament showing how much sanctions evasion took place in the 2014 sanctions because of the annexation of Crimea. It was about 8% of trade had been gone through all sorts of interesting channels into Russia. So there will be sanctions evasions, and then the question is who gets hit. I hope that we follow the precedent that we have seen with Iran sanctions, where it is the firms or the banks which are evading the sanctions that are hit, and not countries are not brought in, because that could be one way in which this secondary sanctions spread and could become a source of fragmentation. The second area, and Arantxa hinted at this, and she knows my views on this subject, is if the following viewpoint gains much traction. And this viewpoint was articulated very recently in London by the British Foreign Minister when she gave a speech this week, when she said, you know, economic access to our markets has to be conditional on good behavior. And good behavior is defined as being a liberal democracy, respecting international law, and the list goes on, okay? And so instead of access to markets being defined by the WTO rulebook, which is of course the starting point of where we should remain, I fear there is a growing number of policymakers for whom their view is that the most beneficial market access should be reserved for countries like us. And this is a very dangerous road to go down, an extremely dangerous road to go down. And I think we should be prepared to stand up and argue against that, and to highlight that this is likely to lead to not only poor economic policy with impacts for our living standards and the like. That argument I don't think will cut much ice. I think more importantly, we have to ask, well, we will have to argue on consistency grounds, because I think when it comes down to figuring out who our friends and allies are, they might not all be lovely liberal democracies that don't go around invading each other. Some of our suppliers of energy and the like might be countries with other types of governance configurations. Let's just put it that way. So I think we will need to push back on that. And this is why I think you're absolutely right that there is a potential problem with respect to bloc formation. And this is something we will have to watch very carefully as we go forward as well. So that's it. I suppose the last thing to say about the conflict in Ukraine is that it does indeed highlight another theme that Arantxa raised, and that is that the rule book we have isn't good enough at the moment for managing all of the forms of interdependence. We have a very strong rule book on import curbs and import policies. We have a very weak rule book on export controls. And this has become a growing area of concern where I think we need to think about other ways forward. So in terms of what could be done here, I would like to build on what Arantxa said by arguing that I think this organization will need to reorient itself a little bit less focus on liberalization and litigation, and much more on helping to diffuse tensions and head off tensions between members. And this will, I think, require an organization which does a lot more of recording policy, a lot more analysis of that policy, encourages a lot more deliberation on public policy, not necessarily on negotiating new rules, but certainly perhaps developing understandings about how policy should be unfolded in key areas. And those key areas would include the types of subsidies that we will develop and deploy in order to tackle the imperative of climate change. Can we come up with an understanding of the subsidies that we'll use, which will try and minimize the cross-border harm and minimize cross-border tensions. So I think that's an area where a lot of productive thinking could be done. I also think more generally with respect to subsidies, we need to figure out which are the subsidies which are worse versus better. So which ones generate less cross-border spillovers, and try and encourage policy to focus on those. So these are areas where the expertise we have in the Secretariat should be combined with the expertise elsewhere, and policymakers encouraged to develop understandings in these areas. And in the digital area, we do need to have a broader horizon. This is an area we need to consider more. It's great that the JSI on e-commerce is going the way it is, but this is the tip of the iceberg in terms of future action. So yes, overall, I do see an evolution in the role of the WTO. I'm not afraid of that. We've seen the IMF and the World Bank evolve over time as the key parameters in which they operate changed. And I see there's no reason why this organization cannot evolve in the same way as well. I see the institution as being able to help reduce some of the angst in the system, trying to reduce some of the uncertainty as well by encouraging governments or documenting what governments are doing and making that clearer, improving transparency, encouraging deliberation, and alike. And so I think governments should try and see this organization as a place where tensions are managed rather than opening up new markets like we have done in the past. So maybe that's an evolution. And I don't see any of that being inconsistent with the 3 sets of recommendations that Arantxa put forward. Maybe I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Simon, for your thoughts as well. Very interesting. Let me now open it to Q&A, either for both of you here in the audience physically with us, but also online. We have a few questions online already, but I'd like to maybe give the opportunity to see if someone from the floor would like to start. Yes, please go ahead.
I'm DDG for giving me the floor. Shakaran Kumosri from Thai Mission. Dean Gonzalez, I think I find your analysis of trade risk, quite interesting. I just wonder, are these risks that you have elucidate unique to WTO? And if not, how does our sister organization, just to name a few, WIPO, WHO, has dealt with this risk? That's for you to entertain my question. And Professor Efnet, you have mentioned that perhaps you'd like to see more public policy analysis by the Secretariat. And as someone who worked with the WTO Secretariat, I think I feel very sympathy for a lot of work that Secretariat tried to do, and just for being criticized for things that should not be doing. So to analyze public policy, that's going to open new Pandora's box for criticism by some members. So I wonder, how do you reconcile this, the caution that the Secretariat have to take when doing something that would not offend it or would not anger some of the members? So that's the question that I'd like to start with the other speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. I'm going to take a couple more, and then we'll come back to Arantxa and Simon. Yes, Carlos, please.
Thank you very much, DDG. Carlos Grau, officially from the Global Express Association that represents the 3 express delivery carriers, but I'm speaking in a personal capacity today. Thank you for a fascinating exchange. You have strong supporters for the system in the private sector. I haven't heard anyone mention the private sector. In the evolution of the organization, shouldn't some kind of structured relationship with the private sector be built? Because it's famously lacking in the current structure. And yet, like I said, you have supporters. At the end of the day, the WTO and its members set the rules, but trade is conducted by the private sector, by business. There's a call from 14 business organizations this week to do so. What is the mood? Is this something feasible? Is this something we could contemplate in the future? The second question, perhaps to Professor Evenet, this move to or shift to focus more with managing tensions amongst the members and less market opening. You mentioned at the same time services as an area with potential where there's been growth, and yet the multilateral opening of services has been stalled for the last decade, I'd say, in the WTO, and not only, and yet it has huge potential. This leads me to a question about plurilaterals. If the organization's members cannot collectively agree to market opening in crucial areas or to setting some rules in crucial areas, can we foresee a future where there's more ample room for plurilateral agreements? We've just had an example with the domestic services regulation, tremendously useful for sectors like ours. Could we see more of that in the future of the WTO, or does it have to focus solely on easing tensions? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. So the final one, and this is already getting to be a quite a substantive set of questions. Gabriel Marceau, please.
Thank you. A comment, and I hesitated to make it, but now with the previous speaker, I was going to say, I'm more optimistic, maybe, and not denying the risk, but I would say two changes brought by not the current administration as such, but the circumstances, is the new role that DG Ngozi gave in asking the private sector to come in the walls here and talk about production, manufacturing, etc., of vaccine, and the all that came with it. And I kept asking quietly, how can we refuse the private sector to join, as members did in Singapore, while now we're begging for them to collaborate with governments? This is in vaccine, but we won't go back. And the changes are what Arantxa more diplomatically calls adaptation. Me, I tell in my private capacity, the reform are ongoing. The meetings of GSIs are ongoing. Work is moving ahead. The technicalities of where we're going to fit it, in my view, as a lawyer, is a relative detail. Because even in international law, we know that lots of new norms often start with de facto and evolve. So we are reforming, and this has started already. Yeah, I'll stop here as staff.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gabriel, for bringing this dimension to our discussion as well. So let me turn to Arantxa first.
So how have other organizations dealt with the risks that we have outlined? That in reality, not with the risks, but how have other organizations dealt with the change in circumstances? Because this is what is at the heart. Now, every organization in this international rules order has different characteristics. There are organizations that are purely research driven. There are organizations that are about delivering humanitarian support. There are organizations that are deliberative. There are organizations that are purely technical regulatory. And then there is an organization like this one that is, every organization is specific, and this is more specific than others because it has two big pillars that make it very special within the system. One, it's legislative function, it's legislative, and it's legislative technical-political, because the technical in the WTO is difficult to extricate from the political. But then it has a second function, which in the parlance of Montesquieu, we would put into the category of judiciary. I hesitate to use the word judiciary because judiciary is a big word. So let's use judiciary not with capital, but with little. This makes this organization a little bit different from others who do not have this characteristic. So each organization, to answer your question, each organization has to find its own way of adapting to the change in circumstances. Now, to link this with the remark that Gabrielle makes, yes, there are changes in the manner in which trade is happening today. There are changes in the actors on the governance of the organization. This, like any other international organization, is intergovernmental, but the actors in governance today are different. There are many other actors that are very relevant for this, for the work of an organization like this one. And we need to, this is why I used this very diplomatic word of let's look at the governance. Because we need to look at, in this governance, what's the role for other actors? There are clearly other actors now that cannot just simply be kept outside, because their role is far too important also for the legitimacy of what the organization does. And there are also changes in the functions of an organization that also need to be reflected somehow in the space that the organization is given. I very much agree that this organization has an incredible convening power that can be used to build bridges with other realms of international economic policy making. Gabriel has mentioned one in the area of vaccines. With this organization is not responsible for manufacturing, but obviously you need to have a notion of manufacturing if you want to increase vaccine access for the citizens. It's not enough to look at the intellectual property, as we have clearly seen. We would not solve this issue of accessing vaccines at affordable prices by just simply looking at intellectual property rights. You need to look at the production, you need to look at the logistics, you need to look at the cold chain. So clearly this organization has greater convening power that should be used, and the members should agree that the organization uses to build this coherence that I mentioned in point 3, because today the world is all about coherence in interlinking the different aspects of the same reality. Then a final word on plurilaterals. I think it's a discussion that is as old as this organization, and I don't think that I'm innovating a lot when I say that this organization has accepted that there can be variable geometry and there can be different speeds at which members accept different commitments. And this is what's captured by plurilaterals. Or maybe we have to reduce the angst about moving at different speeds and moving on with a more of a menu of options mentality, because the reality is that the situation of the countries are very different. So, I mean, this is probably more on the cultural side than it is on the regulatory side.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Arantxa. Simon, you want to come in?
Yes, just a few thoughts, if I may. So let's start with the first question about the need for or the potential challenges in encouraging further policy analysis here. I think it's useful to go back to an example to highlight what happens when you don't have that analysis. I remember when the Singapore issues were introduced, one of the principal criticisms of the countries that did not want to move forward was that there was not enough analysis, evidence, and data, so that they couldn't even make their minds up about whether or not this was a valuable thing to do. And so I think the absence of an evidence base or some understanding of where the most important cross-border problems are, it holds things up as well. So I think that outcome is clearly bad. Now I'll say something else, which is I think we got ourselves in a situation maybe 3 to 5 years ago where there was such an extreme reluctance on the part of the Secretariat to do an analytical work, mainly because of these pressures, that I'm not sure that really served the system either. So it's something which is a bit, we need a better balance, I think, where the Secretariat is given greater freedom to be able to conduct objective, balanced research in areas which are central to the future of the trading system. And this helps me then build a bridge to the comments about the role of the private sector. Having been someone who's taught in a business school on both sides of the Atlantic for 25 years, I do spend rather a lot of time with private sector business, and I've actually learned a lot about this. And in fact, to be honest, if I think about some of the areas where we have to make progress in the future on, say, digital trade, quite frankly, it will be the public sector learning from the private sector. Who is it? Just by the way, in the same way it was true with TRIPS, where the private sector was had more expertise at the beginning. Now it's a more balanced relationship. And so I think that will be, and that has to be a part of the process. And here, I mean, I think an important consideration is not, this does not just relate to the Secretariat, it actually relates to national trade ministries. How much are they investing in building up their understanding of these areas? And sometimes I see worrying levels of underinvestment. Now, in terms of engaging with the private sector, yes, this is clearly necessary, but I think in the current context, this would have to be balanced by engagement with civil society and trade unions as well. So maybe that's an area where further thought would be needed, especially in the current context. Now, with respect to progress being made, I think the differences I hear between people is not about whether there's no progress or not. It's about the desired speed. And I think most of us would like to see things move faster. And I think I took it as the spirit of Arantxa's comments that there was a growing gap between what the world needs and what the world has in terms of global economic governance in the area of trade rules. And I think many of us would like to narrow the gap. How we can get that gap narrowed and how to do that faster, I think is the question. No one's questioning the fact that there has been useful progress in some areas.
Okay, thank you very much. We also have a set of questions, a number of questions here from our audience. So let me start with the first one from Shamil Sharuddin, a student majoring in international business, who asks the following question. With the current Russia-Ukraine crisis, Russia has set the policy that EU countries should only purchase oil using rubles. In addition, sanctioning against Russia only disrupts global supply chains. What actions can the WTO take in this situation? So that's one. I'm going to read a couple of them, so you may want to address, different ones. Second one is Arundhati Sharma, who says, how do you think the two proposals, Arantxa's proposals, first, to strive for tangible results in the upcoming WTO MC, and second, adaptation process in terms of reform. So how can these two proposals be achieved since it is argued that the inability to adapt has been a major impediment to produce results for so many years? And then there's another one from Sergio Martinez. So for Arantxa, on the 3 points to address the looming risk that the WTO faces, which concrete avenues or strategies could the WTO explore to innovate or reconfigure its partnerships at different levels and enhance coherence in international cooperation? Are there new institutional actors that WTO could cooperate with? You have already talked a little bit about that, but in any case, here we have some 3 questions. And I also have a couple of very interesting ones coming up. So I'll start with this one first, Arantxa.
Thank you. Well, first, for the students in the chat and on the webcast, it's important to understand that there is no such thing as WTO doing. It's what members of this organization do in the organization. So I think it's an important distinction to be made, because as such, WTO does not have the authority to intervene in conflicts against its members, be there big conflicts, medium conflicts, or small conflicts. But obviously, there are rules in the organization that may be disregarded by members, which give the possibility to another member to raise this as an issue in the procedures, in the organs of the organization. First, consulting, and if you don't like, disputing. I mean, I don't think that the inability to adapt can be used. I mean, it's like the chicken and the egg. Because you cannot adapt, you don't adapt it. Because you don't adapt, you cannot adapt. I mean, at some point, you've got to decide whether or not you want to adapt. And this means investing political capital in getting some results done. And the results, the menu of options is already on the table. There are already a number of issues that members have considered carefully in this last month, in the run-up to the date, the last date for this ministerial, which was last year, that focused the mind of the members to get some results ready. The question now is to reignite this process, to produce again a situation where members feel that they have to invest capital in making sure that they put draft proposed solutions for when the ministers come to get those agreements done. On coherence, I think this is an avenue that has been explored a lot in the past. Not formally, because formally the WTO only has relations that are written in an agreement with the bank and with the fund. But I think, there is a former chief economist of this organization in the audience that did work a lot in fostering better coherence between trade and other areas like climate change or even Gabriel has left, but even with the world of work, where of course there are obvious connections. So my point is that we need to structure much better this space of coherence, and that we have to look beyond the World Bank and the fund, and that we have to cast our eyes very widely, because these interconnections are more evident today for everyone, and where I think there is a greater consensus also on the membership of what these connections are. So in the past, there was a bit of a reluctance to accept that these connections existed. Now we understand the connections are there. We just need to understand how can these connections be better leveraged and managed.
Thank you, Arantxa. So just a heads up to Patrick Lowe that I will come to you to seek your views, because I know you would like to share with us. So let me now, but before, I'll give you a bit of time. So let me come now to Simon.
Actually, I have nothing to add to what Arantxa said. I thought it was very good. So, and I too would look forward to hearing Patrick's insights.
All right. Let us have your thoughts, Patrick, on all these issues.
Well, I just have two questions that I think trouble me a little bit. There's nothing I disagree with that's been said, but let's just take it was Pascal Lamy was big on this, missing middle, deliberative function, by all means. But I'm just wondering what use a deliberative function in the WTO has. I'm not saying it's zero. I just think that what's the relationship between a deliberative function and the legislative and litigation functions? I mean, if you're going to discuss something seriously in this institution, they do a lot of that in UNCTAD and other places, but if you're going to do it here, you're going to have expectations with respect to litigation and legislation. So that's my first question. How would you think about going about that? The second is, and this speaks to the question of multi-speed, the JSIs, critical mass agreements, something that we've lived with for quite a while now. These have always been able to maintain formal MFN. Now, de facto is another story, which bears quite a lot of analysis. I worry that if the e-commerce agreement is going to be meaningful and will have teeth, it will be almost impossible, or it'll be extremely challenging to give it teeth, to give it substance without foregoing de jure MFN. And I'm just wondering whether that is a Rubicon that this institution can afford to cross, or how you guys would think about that.
So tough questions for our panelists. Thank you very much, Patrick. And let me, on the first point that Patrick was making, we also have a similar question from Jane Drake Brockman, who says, with even further reduced focus on rulemaking, as Simon seems to be recommending, how will the WTO retain its credibility with and relevance to the business community, especially on digital trade, which I think is in a way a bit of an elaboration of what Patrick was asking. So let me turn over to you, Arantxa, first, please.
So let's say that the deliberative function of WTO, to me, has two big objectives. One is to educate. There are hugely complex issues that a few in this house understand, but the vast majority do not. So the deliberative function is first about educating and making sure everyone, irrespective of the level of development, irrespective of how many teams you have in capital and how much expertise you have the possibility to understand what's at stake. And you know, for some in this room, this may seem like, you know, what's new? But for the vast majority, this is essential, because in many parts of this world, many trade policymakers do not have the capacity to understand very complex issues today they have to face, especially on an issue like the digital economy, where the issues are phenomenal. So first is about educating, using the incredible brain power that exists in this organization, working with others outside these walls. And I see Roberta here, and she does a lot of that, is take into pieces many of these complex things and educate the entire trade policy community. The second virtue of having a deliberative function is that you build shared understanding. I say you don't have 33,000 different versions, that you build a shared understanding, which is the beginning to then get to the next stage, which may be, do we need to regulate this? And if so, do we need to do it here? And if so, how do we do this? Do we need a hard law? Do we need to do maybe have some sort of policy guidelines? Do we need to then maybe have softer law? So, I mean, it all starts with educating and having a shared understanding. Now, I understand your point, which is to say that the judicial, inverted commas, arm has been so strong that it has, in a way, prevented the deliberative function from happening. I also think that we have to be very clear that there must be in this organization a space for deliberation without prejudice. Without prejudice, without this being influencing in any way, shape, or form the legislation or any litigation that one can. So on this one, and this is something that this House has to be very clear about in order to free up a space for this deliberative function. Second, on plurilaterals, this House has different types of plurilaterals, with MFN and without MFN. Okay. So the House has this. So it's just a question of where wants this House to take this. It's not, you know, it's not like a major revolution that we would have to undertake. There is already. Yes, it's very limited in scope, and yes, it's limited in scope because in some cases you cannot just simply prevent others from free riding. If you do a regulation, a regulatory framework on an aspect of technology, you cannot say, well, I will apply my regulatory framework only to these guys, but I will not apply my regulatory framework to these other guys, because by definition, there are things that are MFN in nature. So these are the parameters that have to guide a more rational discussion about variable geometry, which is what this is about. I think the discussion here, excuse me for saying this, but now that I'm a bit freer, I will say it, has been a little bit too ideologically driven and not connected with the realities of the market. And at the end of the day, there has to be a bit of rationality in the discussions that one has. Otherwise, it's totally disconnected from the world in which we are operating.
Thank you, Arantxa. Simon?
So let me start with the missing middle. I see one potential benefit of developing the missing middle is in helping identify problems which, well, issues which people think are big problems, which it turns out when you look at the data are not. So let me give you an example, which is, we had a big discussion about 5 or 7 years ago about steel excess capacity. And there were many claims made that 1 or 2 countries had excess capacity, and this was generating huge distortions in world markets. I looked into this matter very carefully. There was very little, if, and actually I'm being diplomatic, close to zero evidence to support that proposition. Okay. There was definitely excess capacity, but whether there was any evidence of cross-border spillovers was had not been demonstrated. And if we had had the space, perhaps in this house, to have had a number of experts in that area come here and say, okay, show us what the evidence of spillovers are or are not, we could have gauged whether or not this was quite the first order problem that some people asserted. And let's not forget that issue migrated onto the G20 leaders agenda. So there are some trade issues which seem to mushroom potentially illegitimately or inappropriately, largely because I think certain industry groups were very effective at advancing their interests. So I think a deliberative function might be actually useful in highlighting where there are not certain problems. A second example going in exactly the opposite area, and it goes back to the work on competition law that was being done about 15 years ago when people were talking about the cross-border and the trade-related aspects of this. In work that was done then, people showed that when the US and the EU broke up the vitamins cartel, there were actually significant benefits around the world, including in many developing countries. And these benefits were not really internalized in that discussion. And so, this is one of these areas where strong domestic enforcement and mutual support in domestic enforcement could have generated trade benefits, which then were shared more widely. And this type of thing could have been discussed as well. So I wonder if there are topics where bringing together some numbers, industry expertise, legal expertise, often in regulatory areas, would really help. And I think in the area of digital regulation, this would be exceptionally valuable. So I think there is a serious role for the missing middle. Now, let me also speak to the issue that Jane raised in the chat. I would love it if this organization got back into the serious business of negotiating balanced liberalization deals. I don't have a problem with that at all. I'm a card-carrying economist. We tend to think that there are big gains on the table potentially for things like further reform in areas of services, agriculture, and the like. Yes, for sure, I would like this, but that's not where I see many governments being at the moment, regrettably. And so that I think isn't so much on the table. I don't rule it out being there in the future. What I do see happening over the last 5 or 10 years is growing tensions. And we need to have some better way of helping to reduce and manage those tensions. And I would think that if we're going to have trade tensions, that the World Trade Organization might have something to do with helping manage those trade tensions. And I think creative thinking in that regard is important. And to directly come back to Jane's point, I would hope that the business community would find efforts to diffuse and limit trade tensions as something that they might support as well. In fact, I'd find it hard to believe that they wouldn't. So I think that's a little bit my response to this.
So let me just share, because this discussion about the deliberative function of the WTO, and Gabriela alluded to it, let me just share a little bit what we've been doing on the vaccines and why I think, in addition to what Arantxa and Simon have said, there are also some other benefits, which is when Dr. Ngozi came here a year ago, she started thinking, how can we connect more to others to help solve the problem of vaccines? At that time, the issue was, how can you really scale up vaccine manufacturing on the one hand, and how can you distribute, how can you make sure that you get that across the world to where things are produced to where they are needed. So we started several things. One, there was a team here at the WTO doing fantastic work on COVID and response to COVID, and they had started to produce a set of technical notes in this area, and this team had provided a basis of knowledge from which that dialogue could build on, and the team then continued to produce additional notes. Then, Dr. Ngozi used her convening power to connect with the leaders, in this case of three key organizations, the World Bank, the IMF, and the World Health Organization, which goes to the point of Arantxa. The bank and the fund are sort of natural partners to us, but WHO was an indispensable partner in this discussion. So brought them in under the umbrella of a multilateral leaders task force. Then there was the connection with the private sector, because as Carlos and you have been saying, well, this is a critical part. So we connected with the CEOs of the largest producers of vaccines from across the world and started a dialogue with them. And this is, help us first get inputs from those who were working in this area, identify from the WTO perspective, for example, what were the bottlenecks that they were confronting? Were they in the area of trade facilitation? Was it more export bans? What were some of these bottlenecks? And then help us also work with the other organizations to try to bring solutions on the ground. And each of them working in their own areas. The bank has country offices, so we can work in terms of getting vaccination to the last mile. So many different sort of streams of work. And in doing this, I think that it's also about fostering interconnectedness to solve some of these global challenges, because some of these global challenges will not get sorted out by themselves, but they will not get sorted out by one single organization or the members of that organization just working in that context. So I see that the deliberative function can also lead to joint solutions, which the world requires. So maybe we're thinking about doing something similar in the area of food crisis, for example, which is something that we have right now. So with that a bit of on my part, let me just bring the final question, which I'm going to take here from Victor do Prado, which I think is a very interesting one. And he says a little bit in line with what we've been discussing. If you were to describe the WTO, how it works and what it does within 10 years, how would it be?
The organization that the organization that helped save the international trading system from fragmenting. The organization that had the capacity to bring players around the table, use their deliberative functions, their regulatory capacities, and their coercion capacities also to ensure the world trading system will remain a world trading system and not only a part of the world trading system.
Thank you, Arantxa. Simon?
So to add to that, I would say it's the place where policy uncertainty was finally tamed, where the returns to foreign direct investment started rising again, where trade volume growth in goods started picking up, where the digital economy did not descend into fragmentation, and where intensified competition delivered lots of benefits to consumers. And that's what I would like to see for it in 10 years time. And I suppose, where exactly as was hinted at, that this organization doesn't descend into blocks, or at least the members of it don't descend into blocks. Yeah.
All right, our next panel will be how do we get from here to there? Okay. So thank you very much with that. Thank you very much to Arantxa, to Simon, to all of you here in the room, and to our virtual audience. It has been a great discussion, and certainly from my part, a lot of things to reflect on. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thanks a lot.